to the next of our videos looking at aspects of communication in a negotiation context, and today we are looking at the crucial element, which is questions, the how, what and why of questions. And just to remind ourselves, in negotiation we are seeking to create value in the deals that we do through the exploration of what it is that drives the parties to the table. If you remember from previous study, the positions we come into the negotiation with are the things that we articulate, as it were, above the line. But where the richness really lies is below the line in terms of the underlying interests that cause us to take up those positions. Now, these are more likely to be implicit, unarticulated and unknown to the other party in a negotiation. And one of the ways in which we unearth them is through effective communication, and a crucial part of that is asking questions. And it's really with that in mind that we are looking at the art and science of asking questions. Start off with a wee quote from Rudyard Kipling. "I keep 6 honest serving men, they taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who." Now, what is Kipling getting at here? For me, what he's saying is that by asking big, wide, open questions, you can actually learn an awful lot. Of course, one has to be listening to the response, and we'll cover that elsewhere. But through asking particularly open questions, one is encouraging the sharing of information, and this applies in a negotiation context as much as it does anywhere else. And we should be asking ourselves why we ask questions. In negotiation, there's a number of reasons why you might be asking questions. The most obvious one is learning information, to understand underlying interests, what's motivating the other parties. You can also be asking questions to challenge propositions, and depending on your approach to the negotiation, whether it's competitive or cooperative, which we will cover later, then you may be asking questions from the point of view of undermining your opponent, from the point of view of putting your opponent on the spot, a cross-examination rather than an examination, if you will. And also to test understanding, just to check that you're both, as it were, on the same page. There's another crucial role that questions can play, and we'll look at that in a couple of slides' time. Miles, in a 2013 article, which is in the recommended reading, broke down the reasons why we ask questions into a spectrum. On one side, one end of the spectrum, where he was suggesting that it's the pure seeking of information, right down to the other end of the spectrum, where he was saying, really, we're not seeking information at all. And there were a number of points marked in between. And we're just going to briefly illustrate the points on the spectrum with some examples. And in doing so, we should be starting to develop a self-aware questioning style for ourselves. So the first point on Miles's spectrum then, at the high end of information seeking, is where we genuinely do not know the information that we are after, but we hope that the party we're asking does. And there's some very simple examples. Where did you put the car keys? What age are you? We don't know the answer, but we hope that the person we're asking does. So it's very pure information seeking. Next along the line is the testing, the understanding. This is what teachers do all the time. I know the answer, I just want to check that you know the answer. And this again has a crucial role in communication in negotiation, where we want to check that what we've said has been heard and has been understood in the manner in which we communicated it. In a teaching context, we might ask our pupils, what's 144 divided by 12, to test where their knowledge is at. In a negotiation context, you might ask the person on the other side of the table, what do you think our standard terms are, just to make sure that they have a grasp of the proposition that may be on the table between you. Getting further along the spectrum, and again, less pure information seeking, and where the question is serving a secondary purpose, if you like, is where I want you, in giving your answer, to put it on the record. This is something that you might think of perhaps in a court context, either in examination in chief or in cross-examination, where I want, for some tactical or strategic purpose, you to express the particular answer that I think you're going to give. In a court context, did you murder Professor Plum? A defence counsel will ask that of his or her client in order that the client has the opportunity vocally and expressly to set it down as a matter of evidence, as a matter of record, that he or she did not do the thing that she or he is accused of. In a more prosaic negotiation context, it might be, did I hear your product lasts 4 years? Now that is a way of getting them to confirm, again checking understanding, but it also means that they are committed to that because they have stated it expressly on the record. Next on our spectrum is the idea of norm establishing. So again, it's even less about the information seeking and much more about another purpose in the form of a question. This is where we might have a suggestion or a proposal, but we don't want to state it as a firm proposition. We want to state it as a question in order to invite others' views on our suggestion. So, what if we adjourn at 6, pick up in the morning? Is that a constructive way to go forward? It's a question, but it's actually from an idea you already have in your mind, and what you want it to be done is tested and invite, as I say, others' views on it. What if we went to the cinema tonight in your domestic context? Might be another example. Beyond this, there is the perfunctory category of greetings. And greetings really are where, although it's in the form of a question, it's really just a basic statement in order to validate one another's humanity. It's part of our basic social interactions as we ask each other questions like, how are you? Is life treating you okay? These are part of what other writers have called phatic communion, where we essentially make small talk as part of the social preliminaries that remind us that we're all human and that kind of soften us up before we get down to whatever the real business of the day might happen to be. They are polite. They're in the form of a question, but actually we do not want anyone to unpack the details of their life, their relationships, their trials and tribulations at that, and it would seem socially odd if that were to be the response. At the furthest end of Miles's spectrum are rhetorical questions, and literature is replete with examples of rhetorical questions, questions that we state to which there either is no answer, but for which we certainly do not expect an answer to be given. They're often sardonic, they're often ironic, they're often to make a point in a dramatic or, as I say, perhaps sardonic way. So, are we not human? And you think of Shylock's wonderful speech in The Merchant of Venice, for example. Or, more humorously, what's another word for thesaurus? Again, the joke is in the question. We don't actually want a serious answer to that. In terms of format of questions, I started off this film with a Kipling quote, and we come back to open questions now because they really are great tools in the negotiator's box for trying to unearth the underlying interests of the parties. And again, these go from very broad to much more selective and choice-based, but yet still open questions. So how, what and why are extremely broad, very unpredictable. We don't know the possible range of responses in any of those questions. And then we could narrow that more to questions like who, which, whose, where and when, which are much more about, from a more select band, perhaps a more detailed, narrower range of possible responses. And we're trying to, again, unearth more and more specific information there. And open questions really, deliberately and well used are a wonderful way of trying to unearth further and deeper information to help the negotiation move along. There is a place for closed questions. Closed questions offer only a limited range of responses. Often it's the very binary yes or no. They have their place in confirming and in checking. Can I just check? Did you receive the letter in the post? It's a yes or no. And having checked that point, we can then move on to the next point. And typically we associate them with formulations like does, did, have, and would, for example. Stewart and Cash in 2011 suggested that in asking questions in a negotiation context, we can use two techniques, and they're both forms of funneling. We can either have traditional funneling, if you like, from the broad to the narrow, or what they called inverted funneling from the narrow out to the broad. And I'm going to give you two very simple examples of this just to illustrate the point. But again, in becoming self-aware communicators and self-aware question askers, we can maybe think, should I try and approach this through the use of a funneling technique? So here's our first example. In our car buying scenario, the salesperson might ask, what are you looking to buy today? The response might be a second family car. That gives the salesperson some more information to think about and maybe start to draw in the funnel slightly more narrowly. What will the car be used for? Well, it was for commuting to work. Okay. Who will be driving it? It's my daughter and me, and the picture is being built up here as the information becomes more detailed. What's your budget? Very detailed question. The budget's given. And from that, the salesperson may have an idea of the sort of product that would be of use and able to be purchased by the prospective customer there. So that's an example of traditional funneling, very, very common in sales negotiations, from the broad down to the narrow. An example of inverted funneling from the narrow to the broad. Again, very simple scenario, perhaps in an employment context, perhaps a manager talking to a member of his or her team. Maybe somebody who's a bit unhappy. Do you still actually want to work here? Putting that direct question can really focus the attention, but if you recognise that it's a closed question, you can only really answer yes or no to it, or perhaps the answer, I suppose so. Well, what is it you like about working here if you want to work here? I like dealing with the public. Okay, and if you like working here, or you like certain aspects of working here, and you want to continue working here, where do you see yourself in a few years? Perhaps they see themselves leading a team. Okay, we've got an objective there that is somewhere in the future. What will it actually take to get there? Well, let's see. And that's a much broader conversation that's just started. Now, I appreciate this is a very simple example, but again, in a negotiation context, perhaps to focus on a critical point or a point of impasse, and negotiation, remember, can be in a managerial or employment context as well. You can see how it goes from something that's quite negative and very tightly, narrowly focused to something quite broad in the space of a few simple steps and using ever broader questions. Just to complete our typology of questions, there are also the non-question questions, prosodic questions, which I like to use a lot, and where the question is actually implicit simply by the posing of the statement. So, in the course of a discussion, you express something through curiosity. I'd like to hear more about this restructure idea of yours. Isn't actually asking any question at all, but the question is hanging in the air and hopefully will invite a positive response and more information sharing. And another form of kind of non-question question, which I don't actually like, is the tag question, where it's a statement that is then turned into a question at the end. I don't like this personally because I think it's a bit pleading, it sounds a bit wheedling, and I think as a self-aware and deliberate communicator in a conversation with a purpose such as negotiation, you should either be making a statement or asking a question, and you should be clear in your mind beforehand which of those you are attempting. So if you need the goods by Tuesday, you say, I need the goods by Tuesday. If you're wondering the time frame within which the goods can be delivered, you ask the question, what is the time frame within which you can deliver the goods? Don't mix up the two, because that can lead to confusion and ambiguity in your communication. Some warnings now on the asking of questions. Be careful. Remember that the communication and negotiation, it's a back and forth dialogue. You should be listening as well as speaking. You should be asking questions and then crucially listening to the response. And how you ask the question can make a difference. Negotiation is about face saving. It's about hopefully relationship management constructively. If you come across as cross-examining someone in a negotiation, then it can come across as bullying and blustering. So the framing of your question, as well as the what you're asking about, can actually serve you for good or ill. And be careful about pestering, about hectoring, about feeling like the barrack room lawyer in the negotiation, because that is likely to have an alienating effect with what we've looked at before, with adverse effects both on this negotiation and its outcome, and on future relationships and future negotiations. And a second warning is that we like to empathise as human beings, and we like to show that we kind of get what another person is going through. And in doing so, we can actually stifle the search for getting new information and actually hearing what it is they have to say. And here's a very simple example of just that, where the interviewer snatches defeat from the jaws of victory. So the interviewer says, "How did that leave you feeling?" And feeling, goodness me, emotions can be complex, so the guest isn't too sure. They need some time to think and reflect about it, understandably. And having asked that lovely open question to begin with, the interviewer then closes it down, perhaps to move the conversation along, to fill the silent air, to show that they can empathise as a human being. Were you unhappy about this? But you see what they've done? They've turned an open into a closed question. There's only a binary range of responses, really yes or no. The guest is still thinking about their emotions, so they're still churning over in their head what an appropriate response is. And the interviewer, perhaps impatiently or again eager to show that they get what the guest is going through, simply actually tells them, "You must have been upset or angry." They're placing suggestions and they're actually now making statements. And what we have here is actually no authentic information that has actually come from inside the guest's head and heart, but actually we have the interviewer creating the question and indeed the response to it. Be careful about over-empathising, turning open questions into closed ones, making statements and suggestions that aren't actually authentic and that again could give a confusing picture as to what is in the mind of the other party in the negotiation. So just to sum up then, how do we make ourselves aware and guard against the dangers of inadvertently poor question styles? Well, I would suggest you question yourself, that before asking a question, you should think about, why am I asking this question? How should I ask it? And what effect will it have? And it may be a further point of preparation to write down questions you think you will want to ask in a negotiation before you go into the room. And that will help you clarify in your mind what information is it you're seeking and what you think the best tools are, the best ways of expressing your questions in order to elicit that information as effectively as possible. That ends our little look at questions.